Hello everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my review of Rocky 4, Rocky vs Drago, the director's cut. Now there will be spoilers within this review, just in case you haven't seen yet the original version or the recent director's cut of this film. Now of course we all know Rocky 4 is the fourth and most successful entry within the iconic Rocky franchise, a huge box office hit back in 1985 grossing over $300 million and cementing Slyvester Stallone as one of the top box office superstars of that particular decade. Now during the shutdown of the pandemic, Slyvester Stallone had a lot of time on his hands and was given permission by MGM to go back and make a re-edited cut of this movie. Slyvester Stallone spent the next couple of months going over the film, making multiple changes to the overall film's tone and direction, certain edits involving the fight sequences, and also adding in certain additional movie scenes that didn't make the original theatrical cut. Now as you all know the plot by now, Rocky 4 sees Rocky's friend and trainer Apollo taking a huge comeback to the ring while taking on huge Soviet boxer Ivan Drago, and after dying in the fight, Rocky is full of guilt and remorse as he was training Apollo for this fight, and he eventually goes on to strive for revenge in a bout against Ivan Drago in Russia. Now I've already done a review of Rocky 4, the original cut itself, and I will leave the link within the description and you can check that video out. So because I've already covered the film in terms of its overall plot and story, this video will really be more about talking about the various differences between the original version and the director's cut, or whether those changes should have been made. So then, in a general summary, when I look back over this edited version, I really think this is a cut that wasn't necessary and actually takes away a lot of the special elements of the film itself. Slyvester Stallone has gone back and added certain material and certain scenes. This primarily involves both Apollo and Adrian, and for the most part this is good, and I've stated in previous videos that if there was any improvements within Rocky 4 that needed to be made, it was in the earlier part of the story where we add more far weight and justification for Apollo wanting to get in the ring with Ivan Drago, and also the greater scenes with Adrian as well just provide much more of a context in Rocky's overall decision to take on the Russian. But the ultimate dilemma here is that while Stallone has added in lots of additional scenes, he's also changed and chopped up a lot of the scenes that I felt were very good about the movie itself and made it so special. Now the result of this leaves this film very much disjointed in many ways in terms of the flow and overall segmenting of the particular scenes. Especially in the first half of the movie, it feels very choppy. There are certain scenes that are cut halfway through, certain dialogues are taken out halfway through. So what's basically happened here is that while Stallone has added in lots of material, he's taken away a lot of scenes as well. Now, I think what happened here is that Slyvester Stallone was allowed to go back and make a re-edit of the film, but he was still under a mandate to keep it at the same runtime of around 1 hour and 30 minutes long. And in trying to go for a much more of a serious, dramatic edge in terms of the overall tone, Slyvester Stallone has actually made this a far less entertaining and less watchable film, and that's really a crime given how much the Rocky films overall in terms of the entire franchise are very entertaining and have endless rewatchability value. So we're now just going to go over the various differences throughout this edited cut in terms of additional scenes and scenes that were taken out in comparison to the original version. So the first thing we talk about is the overall beginning. Now if you remember from the original version, we had that great sequence where we showed both the American glove and the Russian glove coming together in a big massive explosion with the iconic song Eye of the Tiger playing in the background. That was a great way, I think, to introduce you to this film overall, to pull you in straight to the story. And when we followed that shortly with the initial sparring rematch between Apollo and Rocky at the end of Rocky 3, which was promised if Rocky indeed regained his title. Well, we changed that here because in this version we begin with flashbacks of Rocky 3 in the beginning when Rocky loses his fight against Clubber Lang, and then shortly after he has his meeting with Apollo where they agree that Apollo will train him in order to regain his belt. And then we get the soundtrack song that wasn't put in the film, The Sweetest Victory, playing over shortly, where we get the opening title playing very much in much more of a silent background. Now this wasn't a terrible idea, but I just felt it didn't have that initial pull that we had from the original version. It's very much more of a slower start, very much in spirit as what we saw with the previous 3 films overall. And I just think this was a recap. I think they could have just added a bit more energy. It wasn't really necessary. I believe Stallone was trying to add more context into the previous relationship between Apollo and Rocky, but we get context of that throughout the film, so there was no need to change this element. We're now going on to the next scene, which I think was a good change. This is where we see Apollo at his house talking about the emergence of Ivan Drago. We go to a previous scene where we see Apollo in his swimming pool and they see the emergence of Ivan Drago in his press conference, and this was good because it's added much more justification, I believe, and narrative as to exactly why Apollo wanted to fight this man. It also backs up what we saw in the press conference, where originally the Russian promoters wanted to fight Rocky because obviously he was the champion. And we allude to that in this conversation here, where basically Apollo asks Rocky, well, are you going to fight this man? And Rocky's very kind of circumspect and unsure, and this gives hints that Rocky really wants to retire, and this provides further context to the later conversation that we see between Rocky and Apollo, where they talk about changing who you are. So I like this because this is one of the key areas where I felt there could have been an improvement over the original, adding more weight and context as to Apollo's decision overall to fight Drago, and he talks much more about the propaganda narrative being established by the arrival of the Russian, and again this is tying back to the obvious Cold War relations between the US and the Russians media. Another very good merit throughout this edition was the fact that we got far more additional scenes of Adrian, and we saw this in the opening part of the movie, where shortly after talking with Apollo, Rocky invites him over to dinner and they talk again about fighting Apollo. Adrian disagrees. Now we had this in the original, but now in this version we have far more additional dialogue where Adrian talks to Rocky the fact that she feels that Apollo doesn't really care as much about the Russian propaganda. He's doing it more for his pride. He still wants to see as if he's got what it takes to be a fighter. He's still fighting for his own attention, and again this is greater weight and context, looking at it from a different side in many ways, that everybody doesn't just agree with Apollo because he's a likeable character. There is somebody that looks at it from a different perspective and doesn't understand why Apollo fights. And this again is just another evolution in Adrian's character, establishing how much more of a confident and authoritative figure that's what she is. If you remember how shy and introverted character she was in the beginning of the franchise in the first installment, and we look over subsequent films after that and we see how much Adrian has grown in terms of her personality and confidence. And I think this edition is probably what showcases Talia Shire's performance the best in terms of Adrian as an overall character. So the big talking point about this film was that we exercised the scene involving the robot. In the original we had a family scene where the family are just very happy celebrating Paulie's birthday, and because of this Rocky buys him a huge AI robot with a feminine voice. Now many people have mocked this scene overall, but I don't understand why, because for the most part it's a very harmless scene. It provides from very light-hearted moments and brevity, and again it's just establishing how much of a happy place that Rocky is in now that he's regained his title. He's on top of the world and he's very happy with his family, so I didn't see any need to take this scene out at all. Now yes, people may feel there's much more of an 80s cheesiness stigma to this scene, but so what? You know, at the end of the day you have to look at these films in terms of how it supports the story itself, and I believe there was nothing wrong with it. It's literally about a minute and a half scene, so there's no problem with it at all. It doesn't impact the overall product of the film in any negative way, so I didn't see why he had to take that out. He also took out the scene when Rocky talks to Adrian in the bedroom later on. Basically they're coming together with the cake, and again, why take this scene out? It's just establishing how happy the couple are together, and by taking these scenes out it just makes the film, like I said, a bit more choppy, because we go from Adrian talking to Rocky and then we jump quickly to the overall press conference. We then go on to the press conference for the Apollo versus Drago fight, and certain changes have been made in terms of the overall scenes and the vantage point. So in the original we get far more close-up of all of the personalities involved: Rocky, Apollo, Paulie, Ludmilla, that's Drago's wife, and also the Russian promoters and Drago himself. But Stallone actually changes it here, where we got a much more of a faraway pan shot, so we see everybody in one singular shot as the conversation is arriving. As we saw within a trailer, we have far more lines of dialogue, so essentially he's the one who says that he does not come here to lose, and we cut out a lot of Bridget Nielsen's lines throughout this film. We get some more lines from the Russian manager. This changes doesn't really add much. I don't think there was any reason to change the press conference as it was. It establishes the same point that Apollo is very confident, he's very brash, and he's very much enjoying the moment back in the spotlight, and he very much provokes the Russian media and Drago himself, and then we get that confrontation between the two. So really we get the same lines of dialogue, we get the same narrative, but it's just shot from different angles, so it doesn't really add anything new to the overall story. Another crucial scene that I felt shouldn't have been taken out was the scene when Apollo is talking to Rocky just hours before they go into the ring. And this is again a very good scene in the original because it adds just much more of that levity and context as to why Apollo wants to fight him. So we cut out the whole dialogue where basically Apollo feels like he's eating snails and Rocky thinks that he says nails, and that's just a lot of good banter and comedy between the two. And then Rocky once again tries to talk Apollo out of this fight, basically stating that it's just an exhibition and it doesn't mean anything. But Apollo is very steadfast in his determination. This is us against them. What are you talking about? So again, this is just further underlining Apollo's resolve to fight, and this should have been kept in. I don't understand why Stallone took this out, because it's a very key scene again to underscoring the motivation behind Apollo's determination to fight Drago. And then we go on to the Living in America scene, and for the most part the spirit of this sequence is kept the same. The further additions is when we see Drago looking up in the ring, and we get quick cuts of him looking really more disorientated at what's going on around him in terms of the ring entrance presentation. There are different changes in the sequencing of Apollo's dancing routine, and where we see the dancers and close-ups of Rocky and Adrian. It doesn't quite flow as well as the original, but overall the effect is still quite the same. And one thing I noticed in terms of the overall sound of all of the soundtrack songs, it almost sounded too clean. Maybe again I'm too much referencing to the original movie, but just certain songs and the overall tones of the music, it didn't quite have that same raw, real visceral feeling about it that what we got from the original film. And as in keeping with this film overall, a lot of Bridget Nielsen's lines and scenes were cut out again. The original version had Ludmilla talking with Apollo's wife and just saying good luck for the fight. Again, a 10 to 20 second scene, doesn't really affect it if you take it out. Why does Sly do this? Now, we could be very cynical here and relate to the fact that, as we all know, Slyvester Stallone was married to Bridget Nielsen during the production of this film, and they had very much of a contentious divorce shortly after. So is this Stallone kind of being a bit more retributive here by cutting a lot of Bridget Nielsen's lines out? I don't know, but we move on swiftly from there, and we go on now to the fight of Apollo and Drago. And I think overall, as a fight sequence, this is far better. It's far more longer. Apollo actually puts up a lot more resistance in the beginning of the opening round. He moves around a lot more, he throws a lot more punches. Now, he does get knocked down in the first round, so this is far more of an intense encounter than what we saw in the original version. So I actually liked this, an improvement over the first version, because by having a far more prolonged fight, it really does pull you in terms of the overall damage that Apollo takes. We get various additional cuts where we see Rocky showing far more of a concern when Apollo is getting beaten in the ring. He basically says, "Don't do this to me, man." And then we get a few more lines of dialogue from Apollo where he tells him not to stop this overall fight. So it really makes more of a valiant effort from Apollo in terms of fighting Drago. And then we get a few more additional lines from Drago himself when he wins this fight, when he basically says, "Everybody will know my name." The delivery wasn't that sound, to be honest. I can understand why Stallone cut this in the original version, and again, it doesn't flow because they still have the iconic line from Drago, "If he dies, he dies," but it still doesn't flow as well, where we cut straight forward to the funeral. And again, this felt very choppy to me, and it was really disorientating, especially when you have fond remembrance of how the original version went. So again, I think Stallone overcut this overall sequence. Now we go on to the funeral scene of Apollo, and this is the one thing that I criticised about the original, where I felt the funeral scene definitely should be prolonged for longer. In the original, we only see a speech from Rocky, and it's very much more of a somber outpour of emotion. But in this scene, we see a scene from Duke talking about, again, the way of the warrior, and this is what Apollo wanted, and almost trying to justify why they took the fight and put him in the ring, because it's what he overall requested from them. And again, this is very good because it never felt right that Duke never got to say anything during the funeral in the original version, right? So this is a good atonement here, and again, it adds a lot more weight. And I like the scenes from the sadly departed Tony Burton here. He speaks of very much of a statement like fashion and a sincerity, and again, just adds weight overall. I also like the fact that we had a far more of an emotional outpouring from Rocky, and again, this is good context because we know they've had a very good relationship since Rocky 3. So this really amped up more the emotional impact of the funeral itself. And once again, we had more additions with Adrian when she comes through and she's consulting Apollo's wife, and she goes to consult Rocky himself, and he basically states that he's to blame, and she's trying to console him. So this is absolutely one of the best improvements in terms of the additional cut. We then go on to the next sequence, and this is the meeting with the boxing commission with Rocky, where basically we know now that Rocky intends to go and fight Ivan Drago. And this was a scene, if you remember, was actually in the original trailer for the theatrical release, and it was taken out. And it's always bothered me that they never had this scene in the original version, because again, it adds a lot of weight in the overall decision making that Rocky makes in terms of fighting Drago. And of course, it makes sense that the boxing commission would outline their concern. The last opponent that Ivan Drago has fought was killed in a ring. So Whether you have much more of a fantasy story in Rocky or a more realistic story, it makes complete sense there would be some sort of conversation at the very least from a boxing commission showing their various concerns about their American champion going to fight somebody who's already killed somebody else in the ring. So I like this scene very much, and Rocky is very much of a stoic figure here as the various commission figures pointing out very good logical arguments as to why he shouldn't fight Drago. So this is a scene that absolutely should have been kept in the original, and I'm very glad that they added it within this version. We then go on to the second press conference scene between Rocky and Drago for their fight, and again we cut out less scenes with Bridget Nielsen, where basically she states that they've had death threats and they're fearing for his husband's life, and we of course eliminate the commentary where we basically talk about the ongoing conflicts between America and Russia. You have this belief that you are better than us, can you be so cruel to us? We still get the additional lines by Russian manager where he talks about America being an antagonistic and violent government. Again, we're changing all of the angles and the shots, so it's a bit disorienting again if you're a fan of the original film, and all of these changes don't really add much to the story. Again, I would have kept this scene as it is. We then go on to the next scene, of course, which involves Adrian having a further conversation with Rocky, trying to again dissuade him from taking his fight. Now in the first couple of parts of this scene we do get a few additional lines, but then for some reason Stallone cuts certain lines out. So this is a great scene. Again, it's one of the best scenes of the movie. Again, it gives Adrian another standout moment. So this is a scene that really should have played out in full. There are certain lines when Rocky in the original states that we can't change who we are, we just go along with what we are, and he cuts these scenes out. So I don't know why, because again this is a scene that was fine as it is, didn't need to be changed. By all means add additional dialogue, but you didn't need to take anything away. And again, when you're comparing to the original, it just feels as again very choppy. We then go on to the iconic No Easy Way Out sequence, and of course going into this director's version, one of my bigger concerns is that Stallone was going to essentially take out all of the iconic soundtrack songs and replace them with more contemporary music. Now gladly he doesn't do that, and for the most part the No Easy Way Out is pretty much retained that it is. The only changes really is that the flashbacks are now in black and white in terms of colour, in terms of the Apollo scenes within the ring, and also the previous scenes from the Rocky 1, 2 and 3. So overall this wasn't a change that really didn't take too much difference away from it. Again, maybe by showing it in black and white you're showing a much more of a mental metaphor in terms of the flashbacks sequences itself. So that was fine, I suppose. And again, just my personal preference in terms of the overall playback of the songs, it sounds too clean. What made these 80s songs so special was the real kind of raw feeling. We then get another scene, again more additional dialogue for Adrian, when Rocky has shortly talked over with his son. Again, some good lines of dialogue there. But then we get a very touching scene when once again Adrian is trying to dissuade Rocky from fighting Drago, and we get a very good call back to the very great scene in Rocky 2 where we have a similar narrative when Rocky wants to enter the rematch with Apollo. Adrian doesn't want him to do it, and Rocky retorts to her basically saying, I never asked you to stop being a woman, so please stop asking me to be a man. So that was a very nice touch, a very nice callback to the sequel of Rocky 2. And again, I don't know why Stallone took this scene out. Adrian, for me, in terms of this additional cut, was really the standout character. We then go on to another iconic song, Burning Heart, and in the original version, this plays when Rocky makes his arrival in Russia. Now, for the most part, this sequence is kept the same. The only additional moments here is that Duke makes reference to the fact that Rocky doesn't have any sparring partners. Now, we already alluded to this in the original when Paulie says the line, but it just gives greater context that Duke also argues about it as well. So logically that would make sense. So the following scene when Duke gives a speech to Rocky, telling him how Apollo felt like a son to him, and when he died, a part of him died. Now the onus is on you, you're going to be the one, and you have to be the one that's going to be standing at the end. So for the most part this was kept the same. Stallone decides to film it from a far more panning shot. Again, I don't know why, this is just changing for changing's sake. Of course, now we come on to the training montages, and the first training montage is retained for the most part, I would say. We get a few change edits where we add a few more clips of different angles and different shots of Rocky training and using the punch bags, and Drago using his very much technological gym equipment. But for the most part, the montage is still there. They play the song in full, so I had no issues with this particular part of the film. When Adrian goes to reconnect with Rocky in Russia, the dialogue is kept the same. Again, the only change is that Stallone shoots from a far panning shot rather than a close-up shot. I don't know why, but it doesn't really take away the effect of the moment. And of course, we go on to Hearts on Fire, perhaps the most transcendent song within all of this film, and for the most part that's kept for the same as well. We get a few odd cuts here or there. The sequence for me again doesn't quite have the same flow as the original version, but we still get the great shots of Rocky running and using the speedball and doing the dragonfly sit-ups and the upside down sit-ups, and that's all there. And of course we get the iconic moment where he outruns the car, and we're intercutting with Rocky running up the mountain as Drago is running up the incline of the treadmill, and this results in that truly iconic moment when Rocky reaches the ascent of the mountain shouting Drago. All of that is kept, thank God for that. Stallone didn't change that. That's a good moment here. So the next change that we have is that we get far more in terms of Rocky's preparation as he prepares to walk in the ring. In terms of the taping of the gloves, this is much more of a prolonged moment. We see Adrian helping out with Rocky getting his gloves together. We get a few more looks of Apollo, a few more looks of Duke looking at the Russian officials as they look on. Now, one additional element that they added here was that when Rocky is kneeling down in the sink and praying, as what we always does throughout these films, we cut back to the original scene between Apollo and Rocky where they're having that discussion prior to Drago's fight, as what I mentioned before, and Rocky has this entry in black and white, just a flashback memory to what's going on. Again, wasn't really needed. I would have preferred if he played out this scene in full in the original cut, but again, it doesn't really take away too much from the overall sequence. Now, another notable entry is that Rocky's ring walk is actually a lot longer. Now, in the original version, yes, we established the fact that the Russian crowd are very hostile to Rocky. A lot of them are shouting abuse at him and throwing things down, but this ring walk is a lot longer. We get far more pensive looks from Rocky and Adrian as Paulie, and I liked this because you're just ramping up the tension, you're building up the suspense to the fight. And Rocky's ring walk overall, again, we get far more shots of the crowd shouting, and as he's stepping into the ring and he's jumping around stretching, we get far more prolonged scenes. So this is all good, and it just, like I said, gives a greater weight and sense to the overall incoming fight. Now, one disappointment element here was that they actually changed the ring walk of Drago. Now, in the original, we follow the same trajectory where we get all the smog and the smoke as he enters the ring. In the beginning, it looks like he's got a whole country in his corner. We get the slow motion shots of the silhouette walking through, and we see all the crowd cheering. That was good, and then we get very much of that intense, suspenseful music building up. That was good. But Stallone took out the slow motion face close-up shots went between Rocky and Drago during the sequence. I don't know why, because that's classic. That's classic setting up of the intense contest between the two. So I don't know why Stallone decided to take those out. And again, the ring itself, we get far more of a prolonged sequence. When Rocky and Drago are standing together, we get a few more hints of the commentary between the commentators themselves. This is all fine in itself. We get the great scene where we see the Russian national anthem playing and Rocky is standing as we get the various looks between the two. Stallone changes a few vantage points as we get far more of a side-on look from Drago as he's looking into Rocky. Now we go on to the fight itself, and as I mentioned in my previous review of the original version, the fight between Rocky and Drago still remains today as one of cinema's most iconic and exceptional fight sequences of all time. Now, incredibly, the fight, I believe, is actually longer than the original version, and this is in particular of the first two opening rounds, where Stallone shows Rocky showing far more of a heightened resistance in the early couple of rounds. For the most part in the original version, it's just Rocky taking punches, but here he's actually firing back, and I think this is Stallone's case as well. He wanted to make the fight far more realistic, and also he changed a lot of the sounds in terms of the punches. They have a far more of a softer, cleaner contact about them. Now, this comes to your overall preference. Now, for me, I didn't like it because I think it took away the overall impact of the punches. Again, it felt too clean, it felt too soft. He didn't quite get that real gut-wrenching feel each time Drago was punching Rocky. Now, the fight sequence itself still retains the epic scope and spectacle, mostly from the original version. We do get some weird scenes when Rocky gets knocked down early on in the first round, and we see a voiceover where he's talking to himself mentally. Now, I don't know why Stallone decided to put this in. It's never been something that's been shown in the previous Rocky films, Rocky talking to himself in his head, so I don't know why he decided to put this in. It didn't really add anything, and again, when you're comparing to the original version, it really feels weird and out of place, and it feels almost out of sync and rhythm with the rest of the fight overall. Now, the first 2 rounds, again, are very much more prolonged. It's far more intense, it's far more brutal. Yes, Stallone changes a lot of the shots and edits, but I still think overall the same impact of the intensity between the two is retained. And he keeps the same thing when Rocky has that strike, you know, he's cut, that's still in there. There's that sequence when Drago knocks Rocky 15 feet across the ring, that's still in there. When Rocky is getting the upper hand and Drago punches him against the rope and Rocky lifts him up and throws him to the ground, that's still in there as well. So at least he was keeping the most iconic parts of the fight. And the fight itself, when we get the music playing, the Vince Dakota score, the classic track named War, and we get all of the various cuts and the montages, again, for the most part, that's retained as well. So I was very pleased about that. I was very pleased that he didn't tinker with it too much. Yes, you get the odd changes and the odd angle shot, but it didn't really take away from the intensity of the fight itself. So this was all very good as well. I think the only difference was really at the end when Rocky strikes the final blow. It's almost like he hits a must be 10 to 15 punch combination, lots of body punches and facial shots as well. And I think Stallone toned down the music a bit more because he was going for far more of a realistic feel to it. But again, it still had that epic adrenaline rush. I was still getting very excited, even though I've seen the film multiple times, when Rocky puts together his final assault to take down Drago. So that's great. There are slight differences as well when Rocky strikes the final blow and gets the knockout victory, when he kind of jumps up and it's much more of a elated feel, whereas in the original version he kind of just raised his arms and then Duke just lifts him up. Here Rocky almost jumps up and then you see more of the crowd coming into play alongside here. So again, these differences don't really make a lot of impact, so I don't know why Stallone was changing them overall, but still it's the same result. And then we get to the final speech when Rocky's message about, if I can change, you can change. There's 2 guys here killing each other, but I guess that's better than 20 million. I think most of those lines were kept in, but it's far more of a toned down, it's far more of a somber speech that he gives along here. Again, I think Stallone was maybe trying to tone down a bit of the jingoism in terms of the nationalism, in terms of the whole America against the USSR. He was trying to make it far more of a more sincere gesture, I guess, to Rocky overall. So again, I didn't mind that too much. It's the same sentiment that we played throughout. And then the final change is where instead of playing Hearts on Fire at the end of the movie, in there he plays Eye of the Tiger. I love Eye of the Tiger. Again, it's one of the most iconic movie songs of all time, but it just didn't feel right here. Again, I wish they played Eye of the Tiger at the beginning of the film, as I mentioned before, but I don't know, it just didn't quite have the same impact. And he changes the natural flow of the ending. So the original version, it ends when Rocky's kind of celebrating, his arms aloft in the air, and that's when it pauses that particular moment. But here he kind of walks out of the ring with Adrian and Pauline and Duke, and he almost gives a kind of nod into Drago at the end. There's almost some sort of acknowledgement. I didn't really like that too much, because what made the original so great is that they were really kind of savage enemies in many ways. You know, the original really bit on that sense of revenge and justice, but here it's almost as if to say, oh, we've reached some sort of common ground. Well, no, there's no real common ground. At the end of the day, Drago killed Apollo in the ring, and Rocky, you know, is meant to be there for revenge. So there's no common ground, there's no common respect at the end of the fight here. So I didn't like that moment too much. And then at the end, Rocky just kind of walks off with the others, and then the film pauses there. So it really felt more of an ending in spirit with the original movies, and it's far more of a somber take, I feel, rather than what we get to the much more euphoric ending of Rocky 4. So I didn't really like that. I wish Stallone just kept that ending. It wasn't a terrible ending, but again, it just, after all of the height of the action and the spectacle and the victory, we don't capture that euphoric moment. We kind of just get to that euphoric moment and then we settle down, and then it kind of just peters out towards the end. So that's what I didn't like about that overall. So really, that's it really in terms of the overall changes and differences between the original version and its director's cut. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I just felt, to be honest, that this was an edit that I think was kind of forced more on Stallone. I still think the same runtime was imposed upon him, and we've seen that particularly with the numerous scenes that I mentioned where there was nothing wrong with those scenes, the theatrical cut scenes, but yet Stallone kept cutting out lines of dialogue. And this is because he had to add in other parts, and in order to keep to the same runtime, he had to take out other parts. And that's why this edited version really has far more of an unbalanced feel. when you're making a director's cut, I think the ultimate goal is to keep what works and then adds more to it to supplement what works, right? So it should really be a longer version. We've seen this right the way through with the likes of the Lord of the Rings films. Kingdom of Heaven had a very good director's cut as well. But Stallone hasn't done that here. Like I said, he's chopped and changed all over the place. So it ends up being very distorted and almost, I would dare say, a bit amateurish, a bit messy. You know, the editing is not great in this film as well. So I just think, if we are ever to go back and revise Rocky 4 again, then I actually feel we need another director's cut, where what we do this time is keep all of the stuff within the theatrical version. There was nothing wrong with the theatrical version as it was, keep that what it is, and then we add all of the extra scenes of Apollo meeting at Rocky's house, we add all of the Adrian scenes, we add all of the funeral scenes, we add all of the boxing commission scenes, right? So if you add all of those scenes in and keep the theatrical version as well, then that's what I believe will be ultimate definitive take of Rocky. You know, you take away all of the added cuts and the minor changes toward the montages because that spoils the overall flow of the film. I think you keep the fight back to its original version. You keep the enhanced version of Apollo's fight with Drago because that was better, but Rocky's fight with Drago, you go back to what works before. The training montages, you go back to what worked before, you go back to the original version and just keep the additional stuff from the first half of the movie. So who knows, maybe there's some whiz editor out there who's passionate about Rocky 4 and will pull together some sort of re-edited version that makes the changes that I've outlined here, hopefully. But that's it really. That's my general thoughts on Rocky 4, Rocky vs Drago, the director's cut. It doesn't take away from the original. It's always iconic to me, very integral film growing up. But this is one of those instances where I feel the director's cut wasn't necessary and what we got here wasn't quite put together as what I felt it could have done to enhance the overall movie in terms of the original version itself. So those are my thoughts and review on Rocky 4, the ultimate director's cut. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you've indeed seen the director's cut, how do you think it compares to the theatrical version? Do you think it's better? Do you think it's worse? What parts do you think were better? What parts do you feel Stallone should have kept in? And what parts do you feel he should have taken out? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you'd also like to see me review other installments within the Rocky franchise, then let me know in the comments and I can provide a review of those movies as well. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more